A fire is lit in the belly of a 1907 steam locomotive. Slowly, the locomotive is brought to life in the engine house of the Monticello Railway Museum. The museum began as a place to preserve an operating steam engine and has grown into one of America's finest operating railroad museums. This is its story. The seed that grew into the Monticello Railway Museum was planted in the 1950s as America's railroads made the switch from steam to diesel. Among the last Midwestern railroads to complete the transition were the Illinois Central and the Grand Trunk Western. Beginning in 1958, another Midwestern line, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, began operating excursions with its few remaining locomotives. Following the end of steam, the Q, as it was known, kept two locomotives operational to continue those popular excursions. Northern Type number 5632 remained operational into 1965. Mikado number 4960 continued running into 1966. That year, the Q's president retired, and his successor had no interest in steam excursions. In central Illinois, a group called the Society for the Perpetuation of Unretired Railfans, or SPUR for short, was founded to encourage the Q to keep the trips running. Their efforts were for naught, and the last Q excursion ran on July 17, 1966. So Spur turned its attention to running steam trains of its own. Spur found a home on the outskirts of Monticello, Illinois, just off Interstate 72 west of Champaign. Not only was the community a willing host, but Spur was able to purchase a ready-made right-of-way in several miles of the abandoned Illinois Terminal Railroad. Part of a popcorn field was purchased northeast of Camp Creek, and Spur members proceeded to build a small yard for their operations. They then turned their attention to laying rails on the Illinois Terminal roadbed eastward toward the village of Whiteheath. The new railroad was christened the Monticello and Sangamon Valley, and operations began on October 12, 1970. The railroad's name was changed to the Monticello Railway Museum in 1982. It's September 1986 as we visit the museum's annual Railroad Days. 2 locomotives are under steam, number 1 and number 191. Also operating is Lincoln Sand and Gravel number 44, a small switch engine built by Davenport in 1940. .040 number 1 was the railroad's first locomotive. She was built by the American Locomotive Company in 1930 and modified with a tender at Monticello. Before coming to the museum, number 1 was used by Western Indiana Aggregate and Stone in Montezuma, Indiana. Number 191 was another Alco product built in 1916 and used by Republic Steel at their mill in Massillon, Ohio. The locomotive came to Monticello in 1970 and first operated in 1972. As the 1990s came around, the Monticello Railway Museum had changed considerably. Steam operations ended as both locomotives came due for expensive overhauls. Taking their place was a locomotive that was almost as rare, an Alco RS2 number 301. The locomotive was built for the Long Island Railroad in 1955 as number 1559 and changed hands several times before coming to Monticello. The museum purchased 7.5 miles of Illinois Central Gulf's Decatur district between Monticello and Whiteheath in 1987. The newly purchased trackage ran parallel to the old Illinois terminal and became the primary route for the museum's excursion trains. In Monticello, the former Wabash Depot was relocated from its original site, allowing passengers to board either downtown or at the museum. Camp Creek Yard was also expanded with additional shop buildings for restoration and repair work. Steam made a surprise return to Monticello in May 1997 when Nickel Plate Road number 587 operated for a month. The 587 is a genuine World War I USRA engine built to the light Mikado design by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1918 for the Lake Erie and Western. The L, E, and W was merged into the nickel plate in 1923, and the engine received its current number in 1925. The locomotive was donated to the city of Indianapolis in 1955 and was returned to operation in 1988 by volunteers at the Indiana Transportation Museum. In 1997, the locomotive came to Monticello for work in the museum's engine shop. As part of the agreement to do repair work, Monticello would be allowed to operate the locomotive for a month to raise funds for ongoing restoration projects, including the museum's own Southern Railway number 401. During Railroad Days 2009, steam once again returned to Monticello. This time it was the newest standard gauge locomotive in the U.S., David Cloke's replica of Central Pacific No. 63, the Leviathan. The original Leviathan was one of 4 sister engines built by Schenectady in 1869 that included Jupiter, famous for her role in the Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory, Utah, marking the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. Leviathan is built to the same plans created for the replicas of Jupiter and Union Pacific No. 119 at the Golden Spike National Historic Site at Promontory. As such, it is not an exact replica, because no original drawings are known to exist. It is, however, a reasonable facsimile of a typical locomotive of the mid-19th century. It's the 17th of September 2010, and Southern Railway 280 number 401 is ready to pull her first official train after restoration, a member special from the museum to downtown. The event marked the completion of a 15-year rebuild that resulted in a nearly new locomotive. The 401 was built by Baldwin in 1907 and last worked for the Southern between Keysville and East Durham, North Carolina, before she was retired in 1949. From there, she was sold for use as a switcher at Alabama Asphaltic Limestone in Marjoram, Alabama. She was purchased by the museum in 1967 and arrived at Monticello in 1970. When the 401 arrived at Monticello, she was in bad shape. The boiler was full of scale and sediment, the running gear was wore out, and the cab and tender were rusting through. In 1995, a donor stepped forward to help fund her rebuilding. The rebuild included a new boiler, a new tender body, and a new cab. When she emerged under steam, she looked as good as the day she left Baldwin in 1907. By the second decade of the 21st century, the area around the Nelson Crossing Depot had seen considerable expansion. A shed for storing motor cars was built alongside the display track lead, and a long car barn was built to allow entire train sets to be stored under cover. A train shed was built to cover the display tracks next to the depot. In 2012 and 2013, a replica of an Illinois Central interlocking tower was built. The tower was dedicated on September 21, 2013, during railroad days.
One of the longtime goals of the Monticello Railway Museum has been to recreate an interlocking tower equipped with some of the different types of machines that were used. But like a lot of things around here, the thing holding it back was funding. And to that end, one of our members, Mr. Doug Nipper, personally donated $25,000 to initiate the construction of this tower. One of Doug Nipper's requests was that the tower be named in honor of one of the Monticello Railway Museum's founding members, the late Mr. Richard P. Stair. Dick retired from the Illinois Central in 1984 and continued his volunteer work at MRM until his passing in May of 2001 at the age of 81. Dick's efforts in the early years of this organization were very important in establishing a good foundation on which to grow, and it is in his memory that today we formally dedicate and name this structure the Stair Tower.
This is fantastic to be able to stand here this afternoon and dedicate yet another project to the Monticello Railway Museum. I just want to take a couple minutes, and I've had numerous people stop me today and inquire how they can get involved, what they could do. That each and every person out here that you see from representing the museum, we are all volunteers. We do all this work in our spare time, and we absolutely love the museum. So we're very, very proud to be able to share this event with you today, and we invite you too to become involved with the organization in any capacity that you would like. We always have folks that would like to work on various projects. This is yet another example. The steam engine sitting over here, that was a project 4 years ago. Whether it's a small project or a large project, each and every year we try to work on 2 or 3 core projects. For instance, we've got this large car barn over here, the Rankin Motor Car building up north of us. We've got the Stair Tower. So this is all part of the museum master plan, and we're very, very pleased to be able to show off the museum to everybody this afternoon. And we're very thankful that you've come out here and are able to participate in this wonderful event.
Lever machines that had been rescued from decommissioned towers in the region were installed in Stair Tower. At the time of its dedication, the tower's contents were rather sparse. Open to the public, the tower makes a great vantage point to see the trains passing. Since its dedication, additional equipment has been installed in the tower. Volunteers have installed a signal system around Nelson Crossing with the signals controlled from the tower.
Next one over. There you go.
The Nelson Crossing Station was relocated to the museum from the nearby town of DeLand and contains the museum's main ticket office. Inside, vintage tools of the trade are displayed at the old operator station. Before the days of radio communication, operators were the eyes and ears in the field for the train dispatchers that controlled the movement of trains over entire divisions.
This didn't get logged in, so there's definitely something. And it just has to go in like
The workhorse locomotive of today's Monticello Railway Museum is Illinois Central GP11 rebuild number 8733. The locomotive began life in December 1958 as Illinois Central GP9 number 9366. She was built as a part of the last order for GP9s as the last steam locomotives were being replaced. Beginning in the late 60s and lasting into the early 80s, the Illinois Central and the Illinois Central Gulf carried out a massive locomotive rebuilding program at the railroad shops in Paducah, Kentucky. The program was designed to extend the life of the existing locomotive fleet and was less expensive than replacing older diesels with new locomotives. The GP11 program was the last large rebuild program for four-axle locomotives beginning in 1979. The 9366 entered the shop in 1980 and emerged as number 8733. The locomotive worked through the 1999 acquisition of the IC by Canadian National and was donated to the museum in 2001. While number 8733 had been deemed scrap when she was donated, inspection found that the locomotive really didn't need a lot of work. She became part of the museum's active roster in 2007.
Hi, how are you?
Looking right at home pulling a passenger train is Wabash Railroad F7A number 1189. Despite her streamlined styling, she was actually designed to be a freight hauler. Number 1189 was the last F7 built by EMD's Canadian subsidiary, GMD, outshopped in April 1953. Most of her service life was spent on the Wabash line between Buffalo, New York and Windsor, Ontario. The Wabash was taken over by the Norfolk and Western in 1960, and number 1189 remained on the railroad's roster until 1979. She was sent to Decatur to be scrapped in 1980, but instead was donated to the museum 2 years later and returned to operation in 1992. The F7 model was built between 1949 and 1953. The smallest diesel locomotive currently operational at Monticello is Milwaukee Road number 1649. The 1649 is a late model NW2 switcher built by the Electromotive Division of General Motors in 1947. This design was the larger of two switchers introduced in 1939, featuring a 1,000 horsepower, 12-cylinder Model 567 engine. The NW2 was produced until 1949, when the new SW7 model replaced it in the EMD catalog. Number 1649 operates on the museum's main line from time to time and is also used for switching chores in the Camp Creek yard. During railroad days, the locomotive shuttles visitors between the yard and the Nelson Crossing station. The only true passenger locomotive on the museum's active roster is an immigrant from the north, Canadian National FPA-4 number 6789. The American Locomotive Company, or Alco, had countered EMD's F-Series locomotives with their own four-axle car body designs, the first of which was the FA-1. Alco's designs were never able to match those of EMD in either reliability or popularity, and by the late 50s, Alco had abandoned the car body locomotive altogether. In Canada, however, the Montreal Locomotive Works held the rights to produce Alco designs. The FPA-4 was a passenger derivative of the earlier freight units, built with a redesigned and more reliable diesel engine. Number 6789 was built for the Canadian National in 1959 and carried the same number when Via Rail took over Canada's passenger trains, much as Amtrak took over trains in the U.S. The locomotive was retired in 1989 and was sold to an individual who moved it to Monticello. Number 6789 doesn't operate often at the museum, but still gets its turn on the museum's trains from time to time. Since her return to steam in 2010, number 401 has been one of the stars of the Monticello Railway Museum. She operates on the third weekend of the month between May and October, including the annual Railroad Days in September. The 401's original boiler still exists, loaded on a flat car in the Camp Creek yard. The 401 is turned at the beginning of each season, alternating the direction she faces. This is done to make sure the locomotive wears evenly over the years and has the added benefit of changing views available for photographers every year. 2018, the 401 was featured on a photo charter. From mid-morning through the late afternoon, the locomotive and her mixed train performed a series of run-bys for photographers along the museum's main line. Our look at the photo charter brings our look at the museum to a close. From its humble beginnings, the Monticello Railway Museum has grown into one of the premier operating museums in the U.S. With a well-maintained line on which to run its varied and growing collection of vintage equipment, the museum is a place for anyone with an interest in railroad history to visit again and again. The museum continues to plan further expansion, and new volunteers are always welcome. Perhaps you too would like to become a member of the Monticello Railway Museum and join in the mission of preserving the history of America's railroads.